Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, Jonathan Steele. Separatist Tuareg groups in northern Mali recently agreed to a ceasefire with the Malian government, following a number of violent clashes that threatened to drive the country back into conflict. The Malian government accused the separatists of renewing alliances with al-Qaeda-linked Islamist groups, and Tuareg separatists seized several towns in northern Mali. They defeated government forces, resulting in the resignation of Mali's defense minister after botched attempts at retaking the key town of Kidal that had been lost to separatists. Mali experienced major conflict 2 years ago when Tuareg fighters allied with armed Islamist groups seized the north of the country following a coup in the capital, Bamako. Now there exists growing concern, not solely from Mali, but also from other countries in the Sahel region as well, that Islamist groups are re-emerging despite being targeted by a French-led military intervention last year. So why has Mali been drawn back into conflict? And wasn't military intervention supposed to bring about peace and stability? What's happened since then? Joining me in the studio to discuss the events in Mali and the region are James Schneider, Editor-in-Chief of Think Africa Press, Wilfred Willey, the ex-president of the Malian Community Council in the UK, and Paul Melly, an Associate Fellow in the Africa Programme at Chatham House. Welcome to you all. But before we start the discussion, let's have a quick look at this video report.
Sudden conflicts and flash fighting, followed by a fragile ceasefire. This has been the ongoing cycle of the conflict in Mali, between the Malian military and the ethnic Tuareg rebels. Last month, the Tuareg rebels attacked the northern city of Kindal in the Azawad territory, while the new civilian Prime Minister of Mali visited the governor's compound. At the time, he was quick to condemn the violence in the strongest possible terms, even implying that the peace agreement between them was now void as a consequence.
Taking into account this declaration of war, as this action cannot be seen any differently, the Republic of Mali is henceforth at war. We will bring the appropriate response to this situation that will not be left as it is.
After a week of fighting, the military failed to retake the city, and a further ceasefire was agreed through the efforts of the African Union. Government sources say that about 20 soldiers were killed as they tried to retake the city. Meanwhile, rebel forces allege that it was the military that initiated the conflict, following a pro-independence protest in the city. Mali has seen many spikes in violence since the conflict began between the government and the Tuareg rebels, a traditional nomadic people who want independence for the Azawad territory in early 2012. The government says they have been infiltrated and subsumed by al-Qaeda extremists. The cost of the conflict has been to places like Timbuktu, a World Heritage Site and a historical seat of Islamic culture and learning, which lies within the disputed Azawad region.
Attacks on the army also affected the surrounding sites, many of which were destroyed, including 3 mosques that were considered UNESCO heritage sites. This mosque here was affected, and the minaret, which is the most visible and the most imposing part of the mosque, was partially destroyed.
In January of 2013, the French government committed an initial 4,500 troops alongside those of the African Union and later the UN, in an effort to keep the peace in this former French colony. Despite this commitment, violence has continued to spike throughout the region, and attacks on forces in key cities has continued. Speaking before the attack in Kindal, the French Minister for Defense stated that the military has stabilized the situation in the country.
There has been a certain stability since the start of operations. The stability in the south has been largely increased. But in the north, there remains a certain number of jihadists who have wanted to regroup. There are less of them than before, but they have nothing to lose. They will give up their life, or the cause, and so we have to fight precisely against any form of regrouping in strength in this part of Mali, in the north.
But the French military's failure to intervene in the conflict in Kindal has led many Malians to feel that the French are not maintaining security in the country. These protesters in the national capital Bamako said that the bloodshed in Kindal was unnecessary and that the international forces could have done more.
I have a message for François Hollande. If he come here to help, he should help. If he's not come here to help, he should take his soldiers and leave. We have had enough. We don't care anymore because they didn't come here to help. They came here to extort us.
For the moment, a fragile ceasefire is in place, and there are hopes that peace talks will resume in the coming months. But the events of the last month show that this is a conflict that follows a destructive cycle. Nathaniel Amos-Sansom, Islam Channel.
Well, Wilfred Willey, let me come to you. Why has this conflict resumed? Why didn't the ceasefire work? And who's to blame?
Well, first of all, they generally say that the peace in Kidal was quite fragile, and the Mali government has control over 2 of the 3 main towns in the northern regions, Timbuktu and Gao. But in the case of Kidal, the situation was slightly different, in that the rebels still were roaming free, armed, heavily armed, it has to be said, and the Malian soldiers were confined in a military camp, which they couldn't leave. And that was the situation. And the new Prime Minister, Moussa Mara, decided to go and visit the Northern Territories and just to see how things were on the ground. And he visited Gao, Timbuktu, and then wanted to go to Kidal to find out how the local population and the government workers and officials were doing. And the rebels did everything to sort of prevent that visit, basically. And when he landed and he wanted to go from one place to another, it was very difficult. The security was very, very sort of tight. The French troop and the UN troops had to accompany him. And, you know, that was the situation.
Did they ever have serious peace talks? Did they ever start talks with the rebels?
Not until that sort of visit took place. The talks really started, well, timidly, but recently after that visit, and after, you know, we had exchange of the conflict was pretty much back on, because people died. Up to 120 rebels were killed, up to 50 people on the government side also perished. And when the Prime Minister went to the governor's office and left there for the military camp, the rebels then used that opportunity to move into the governor's office and took over it and killed about 8 civilians, literally slaughtered them.
Well, let me come on to you, James. I mean, we saw the French Defense Minister speaking there. I mean, why hasn't France sent its troops up there? Why haven't the African Union sent their troops up to Kidal to help?
Well, France does have troops there. France still has about 1,600 troops.
But not in that town.
In Mali. There are French forces that are near Kidal. Kidal, as Wilfred was saying, is a special case. So after the French and African mission was, broadly speaking, successful to retake control of the north. And at the time, the MNLA, the Tuareg separatist group, had been pretty much chased out of the country. They'd been pretty roundly defeated. And they were allowed by France to come back in because France thought they would be useful for administration in Kidal, the most northern of the 3 regions in the north of the country. And also there's a particular soft spot within the kind of French policy-making community for Tuareg claims and for Tuareg desire for, if not separatism, then for greater autonomy. And they recognise that in previous peace agreements that have been reached after different uprisings, what has been promised to the Tuaregs tends to not be honoured, or it's only honoured for the kind of elite level of the rebellion. So there are French troops there, there are other troops there. It's not as if we've suddenly returned to full-scale civil war. This is not us suddenly going back 2 years, but it's just the unfreezing of an uneasy leftover that hadn't been dealt with.
Well, Paul Melly, I mean, the French Defense Minister seemed to be talking entirely about Islamist groups or jihadis, he said. I mean, how strong are the jihadis and how much is it just a matter of Tuareg separatism and nothing to do with Al-Qaeda at all?
Well, the thing is, the situation in northern Mali is extremely complex because Tuareg society is very fragmented and complex. You can't talk about the Tuareg as a single bloc, and you then have Islamists, some of whom radical Islamists, as opposed to what you might call normal mainstream political Islamists. And these radical jihadist groups do include some Malians, but they also include very many people from the Maghreb, Algerians, Tunisian radicals, people, for example, from the Western Sahara, Then there are people who are infiltrating from southern Libya, which is out of the control of any organized authority whatsoever and has become, in effect, a sort of safe haven for jihadist armed groups. So in this very complex situation, the agenda of the French and the MINUSMA force, that's mainly African but with some Dutch troops in it, United Nations force, has been twofold. On the one hand, they've tried to destroy, if you like, the terrorism power of the radical jihadists, but at the same time, they're trying to create a stable sort of peacekeeping situation for the political negotiations that are supposed to take place between those Tuareg who do espouse the separatist agenda and are in armed groups such as the MNLA and the HCUA. Those talks were originally, the principle of the talks was originally agreed in an agreement in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso over a year ago, or almost a year ago, but that's really not been honoured. As Wilfried was saying, the talks haven't really made any progress. When Mali elected a new civilian president, he appointed one of his closest allies as reconciliation minister, but that minister didn't really have the resources, or indeed it seems the political strength to get negotiations moving again. And so for 9 months, sort of, the situation has stagnated, frustration's built up, and while the terrorist groups have continued to move around in the Sahara, occasionally defeated by French or UN troops, occasionally not, the Tuareg armed groups have just been sort of sitting there. And because the political debate the really complex and quite difficult political issues haven't been addressed, and people haven't been really engaged in a political process and facing up to the compromises that might be needed to come up with some sort of deal in the north, resentments have festered. So in the Kidal incident, each side is accusing the other. The Malian government is claiming that it was the separatists who shot first, and the separatists are claiming the Malian soldiers shot first, and we probably won't ever know who caused it.
Wilfried, I mean, separatism, how strong? Is it possible to tell, how many of the Tuaregs really want total separatism? Is that a minority, or is that pretty much the majority view?
Yeah, it's a minority. I mean, the MNLA, the main movement itself, has been fragmented over the years. And if you take the northern regions as a whole, the biggest town is Gao. And Gao, if I'm not mistaken, has a population of about 100,000 inhabitants. The next one will be Timbuktu, with just less than 100,000. And Kidal, the most northern town, is the smallest of them all, with nearly 30,000 inhabitants. And of those, the vast majority are pro-Malian, sort of, if you want. They want to be part of Mali. So if a referendum was held today, Kidal will be an integral part of Mali without doubt. The Tuaregs are in a minority within a minority. And MNLA only speaks for itself and a handful of people. These can all be verified on the ground.
Well, this point that you made, James, thank you for that. The point you made, James, there about the French having a sort of soft spot for Tuareg separatism. I mean, is that one of the reasons why they didn't intervene when this clash re-emerged? You said there are some troops nearby. I mean, one of the people in the clip was saying, why didn't the French intervene? They were supposed to be helping us. They came here. Now they're doing nothing. I mean, is that a fair comment by this person on the film?
Well, I'm not sure whether they were referring, that particular person on the film was referring to that immediate bit of fighting, but it's difficult to say exactly what they could have done on the ground. So they're about, I think, 6 hours of fighting. I don't know precisely what the capabilities would have been to stand in between the two, and whether that would have been a viable course of action. The one thing that France absolutely has to do, and to an extent is doing, is to facilitate a kind of broad, exactly as Paul was saying, a kind of broader agreement that could be reached between the different Tuareg groupings and the central government. And I think it is important that we do view Kidal as a slightly special case, because whilst Wilfried's absolutely correct that the MNLA has and had very little support in Gao and Timbuktu, which is why they're able to lose ground so quickly to the more radical jihadi groups during the conflict. Kidal, they have a lot more strength, and there are and always have been some grievances which do need to be dealt with. So, I mean, France needs to play a role more in that rather than trying to sort out any small specific bits of fighting that take place.
And what about French tactics? I mean, they're not actually using air power and drones and bombing villages, are they, as happens, unfortunately, with the United States in places like Yemen and Pakistan?
No, I mean, the French, I think, are very conscious that they don't want to be perceived as taking sides in the internal, whether it's a conflict or whether it's a political argument, in the internal wrangle over the future of northern Mali. In military terms, their agenda is very much focused on tackling the jihadist groups. And against the jihadist groups, yes, they've been prepared to use serious military equipment. I mean, it's only a few weeks. Yes, only a few weeks ago, French combat planes flew from France to attack a jihadist group in the desert near Gao, because that was seen as a direct case of military intervention. And the French have been strengthening. They've reorganized their defensive defense deployments across West Africa now, because they've taken the view that jihadism, because it's ideologically motivated and people are prepared to die for the cause, and of course many of them are not even from the region and are following a sort of ideological agenda, is going to represent a long-term challenge. So the French have based drones in Niamey in Niger. They're constructing aircraft hangars in Niamey that could accommodate combat planes. They've strengthened their sort of regional headquarters in N'Djamena in Chad, which already has an air base. They've got special forces based in Ouagadougou. They've got a major new base has been built or is being built at Gao in northern Mali. Outpost bases are being constructed in the middle of the Sahara, very much with the consent of the different Sahelian governments. This is very much part of a coordinated strategy.
Yes.
And it should be, occasionally people say, is this a return to old France-Afrique neo-colonialism? No. It's completely different. I mean, West Africa has long outgrown that kind of thing.
Why is it completely different, in what sense?
Well, because the governments we're talking about are elected democratic governments. Right. So the allies in the old post-colonial era tended to be sort of dictatorial, authoritarian, family presidencies, if you like. Right. But the governments of Niger and Mali, Senegal, they're all elected, and it's under their democratic mandate that they've negotiated defense and arrangements with the French.
Are the tactics of the French, accurate? They're not sort of bombing civilians and wedding parties and making terrible mistakes like that, are they?
Well, no, because I think the point about the jihadists is although there are occasionally villages with a tradition of Wahhabist preaching, those are very few, and essentially the jihadists can't be viewed as having sprung out of the communities in the country. This isn't like Afghanistan, where you could say that the Taliban represent a section of domestic Afghan opinion. Whether it's majority or not is a separate question, but the Taliban are essentially Afghan. In the case of the jihadists, as I say, many of them they're from Western Sahara, they're from Algeria, there are Pakistanis, there are Tunisians, there are many people from southern Libya. And because Mali has elected political institutions, I mean, there was a presidential election last September which has been viewed as very credible. There were parliamentary elections in, I think, December, where the turnout actually in the northernmost towns, the ones which have been caught up in this situation, Kidal's a bit of a special case, but in the other northern towns, the highest voter turnout was in the entire country, was in the north.
The separatists weren't calling for a boycott of the elections or anything like that.
Well, the separatists,
if they did, it wasn't successful.
They called for a boycott, and yet 70% of the people turned out.
So that shows the influence. The influence of so-called separatist organizations. They don't have a hold on the way people want to live their life. If it wasn't for the weapons and the threat of retaliation, many people would just go on about their business and be vocal about their allegiance to Mali.
So you think the problem is quite relatively easy to solve then, because there is popular backing for the majority view, and the Tuareg are not inherently jihadi. You think that it could be solved relatively easily.
I think for any negotiations to take place and to at least try to resolve the issue, for any such negotiations to take place, the areas needs to be demilitarized, in my opinion. First of all, the rebels need to lay the weapons down. That wasn't the case in Kidal, and there was a great disparity between what the Malian troops were allowed to do and what the rebels were allowed to do in a small town as Kidal. So they were roaming free, while the Malian troops were asked by the UN and the French to abandon the heavy weapons they had when they were marching onto Kidal in the nearby town of Anefis. So they left most of the heavy weapons before entering Kidal because of fear of reprisals or retaliations. But then they were then confined into in a military camp, which they could not sort of leave for whatever reason. So we need to just ask both parties probably to make concessions, and that includes disarmament. The rebels should be sort of also confined in an area and protected, because we don't want anyone killing anyone. These are all Malians. The point Paul was making earlier was the jihadis are very different from the separatist movement. That's why the French were very happy to intervene and get sort of kick those out. But the MNLA is a different ball game.
We're running out of time for the first part of the program. We can develop all this in the second half of the program, when we'll also be talking about the wider implications of the conflict in Mali on the regional environment in the Sahel. So stay with us.